Well, hello, everyone. My name is Ernie Regehr, and I'm pleased to serve as moderator for this online event today. So hearty welcome to everyone. We're so pleased that you've all been able to join us. As you know, our objective is to explore the overwhelming challenges that impede an early end to the fighting in this horrific war in Ukraine. The organizers are, of course, well aware that stopping the fighting, as daunting as that is obviously not the same as achieving a just and durable peace. But the focus for the next 2 hours will nevertheless be on the much more limited objective of a ceasefire, considering the obstacles to achieving it and the efforts needed to take that initial but basic and essential and urgent step. We're fortunate to have an extraordinary panel and an audience with a lot of related expertise to enable a time of well-informed and productive attention to this crisis that is now in its second year of dramatically heightened combat. I will introduce our panelists in just a few minutes, but first a couple of preliminaries. First, a thank you to the group of people very active in Canadian Pugwash and in the wider Canadian and beyond disarmament movement. Sylvie Lemieux, Bev DeLong, Robin Collins led the organizing of this event, and Adele Buckley was instrumental in reaching out to our Pugwash colleagues in Europe. And we're also grateful to our Pugwash friends in Europe for their help in bringing all of this together. The basic format for this session is that of a webinar. In other words, you will see on your screen only the 4 panelists, plus myself as moderator, along with Sylvie, who will keep us disciplined and on time, and Robin, who will keep track of the questions and comments, which are to be submitted via the Q&A feature in Zoom. Participants won't be able to present questions directly to the panelists, so please submit your questions into the Q&A facility, and Robin will take it from there. We'll be preparing a written report that will be directed toward policymakers and decision makers, and will focus on findings and recommendations that we draw from today's session. In mounting this session, we're all well aware that calls for a ceasefire and negotiations have been controversial. Calls for negotiations to end a war should not really be controversial, but in this case they are, and to some extent understandably so, because in much of the public discourse about the war, such calls have been characterized as appeals to stop hostilities, after which negotiators would simply acquiesce to whatever battlefield situation happened to be at the time. That clearly is not what is intended. A ceasefire is not a final settlement, but it is essential for clearing a path to a more rigorous peace process and a carefully deliberated outcome, a path which Russia and Ukraine should be urged and even pressured to take, recognizing, and this is important, that it must ultimately be for Ukrainians to lead the process that determines their future. In organizing this event and aware of the challenges, we tried to stay focused on a few basic assumptions or principles that should inform any peace process. The first of these was that we must surely make a clear affirmation of the UN Charter principle that it is illegitimate and illegal to try to change borders or regimes by sheer force of arms. The principle is unambiguous, but asserting it from our vantage point also calls for a healthy dose of humility. If we think of the fractured strategic environment that preoccupies us these days, we have to recognize that violations of this principle have in the not too distant past been perpetrated on both sides of that divide. Nevertheless, it is entirely appropriate and necessary for us to hold up and insist upon the vision of an international order in which the militarily powerful do not get to on their own redraw boundaries or replace governments. Second, I think it's fair to assume that in any hogwash-inspired discussion of war and peace, there's bound to be a fundamental wariness of the notion that there are military solutions available to resolve the complex political strategic challenges and conflicts that now bedevil the strategic environment. So we quite properly come to any discussion of this extraordinarily destructive war and the suffering it has inflicted on Ukraine, deeply skeptical of expectations that it could yet lead to a clear, never mind just outcome. The suffering that war imposes should itself make efforts to silence the guns a matter of great urgency, and to that urgency must be added the extraordinary risks to which ongoing war exposes the international order, the threat of widening war, the risk of nuclear use, the degrading of fundamental principles of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I'll mention just one more assumption already alluded to, and that is the fundamental obligation on the part of the international community to ensure that a ceasefire not lock in the military status quo of the moment and just leave justice behind. It is Ukrainians who in the end must decide their own fate and define the outlines of an acceptable settlement. And we know that process is bound to also confront decisions on acceptable compromises to be made. It is, after all, highly unlikely that either side will be in a position to dictate terms of a settlement. And if there is going to be any chance of reaching a reasonably just settlement, even if well short of perfection, the international community will have to be as present and engaged and as determined and consequential in diplomacy and peace building as it has been in pursuit of a military solution. Stating principles is, of course, much easier than ensuring they are honored in the real world, but principles do shape our collective aspirations and help us to see the obstacles that have to be faced. And in our own deliberations today, we'll try to understand the possibilities and the challenges that we face. And as I said, we have 4 extraordinary panelists to guide us. You already have some information on each of them, so I'm going to provide only a very brief reminder of the experience and credentials that they bring with them. Wolfgang Sporer is the adjunct professor in conflict management at the Hertie School in Berlin, and he, of course, has extensive Ukraine-related experience through the OSCE and the Minsk Accords. Sergio Duarte is a former UN High Representative of Disarmament and has served as a senior ambassador for Brazil in a broad range of diplomatic postings. Sergei Batsanov is a former Russian diplomat, a former ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament, and is currently director of the Geneva office of Pugwash conferences. And Maria Levchenko is peacebuilding officer with Peace Action Training and Research Institute of Romania. She has also worked extensively in peace building, conflict resolution, and dialogue, including through the OSCE. So welcome to you all, and thanks so much for being here. We're honored by your presence. Our speakers have graciously agreed to rather tight timelines for their talks. Sylvie's watching the clock, and we'll remind them when the time is about to expire. But we encourage you to feel free to finish the particular thought that you're making at the time when she gives the reminder, and then you finish that off, and then we go to the next speaker. All 4 speakers will begin by addressing the first question: obstacles to the pursuit of a ceasefire, and then immediately to the second question. And then, after we've had those two sets of presentation, I'll invite the panelists to briefly interact with each other, for them to ask each other questions, seek further clarification, and offer constructive counterpoints and so on. And during all of this, Robin will be gathering and consolidating the questions submitted by participants, and Robin will then present them to the panelists when we come to that part of our program. So again, please submit brief questions and or comments through the Q&A function. I will close with the session with some very brief closing observations with a focus on policy or action recommendations that may emerge from our discussion. So we're ready to begin, and I'm pleased to call on Professor Sporer to get us started. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Reger. Well, the first question that stands here is, what are the 2 to 3 main obstacles for more movement towards peace? Before I venture to try to give some answers to these questions, let me first state that the violation of the Russian Federation of the UN Charter that was perpetrated by the Russian Federation against Ukraine is grave. Let me also state that the Russian Federation stands under serious suspicion to having been engaged in atrocious war crimes and other violations of international humanitarian law. So when speaking about aggressor and victim of an aggression, it is very hard when employing certain approaches to making peace or to stopping the atrocities that are going on with an approach where on occasions the phrase both sides will actually be mentioned. I nevertheless will do that, because in what I'm going to say now, when I say both sides, these are simply facts that apply to the victim as well as to the aggressor, both being sides of an armed conflict, in fact, of a war. So let me start with the main obstacles to peace, to a ceasefire, to a cessation of hostilities, by the seasoned concept of ripeness of conflict. I will posit to you that the conflict at this point is not ripe for a ceasefire or for for sides attempting to find a peaceful settlement. Why is this the case? There are three reasons how a conflict can reach ripeness. One reason is a mutually hurting stalemate. Has this war achieved a mutually hurting stalemate? Well, it's certainly mutually hurting. Ukraine is suffering, the Ukrainian people are suffering, but I would posit to you that also the Russian people are suffering from this war. Is it a stalemate? It is not a stalemate, because we have a particular situation here. We have a situation where we have in a way a stalemate on the battlefield, but we also have the belief of both sides that they are getting stronger. Ukraine is looking forward and is believing in the fact that more armament shipments by its Western allies will make Ukraine stronger. The Russian government is, I believe, of the serious opinion that its ability to conscript more people, more young men, and its ability to transform its economy into a command-style war economy will be making it stronger. So when both sides on the battlefield believe they are getting stronger, there is no reason they will want to forego this potential victory they are hoping for, or that in the case of Ukraine, they actually deserve. But both sides are hoping for that victory. In the psychology, that is what is happening here. The other reason, there's a second reason why there could be ripeness of the conflict. That could be a mutually enticing opportunity. That means both sides, again, both sides, one is not enough, would actually have to hope for something really desirable if they cease hostilities. That is maybe the case for Ukraine. That is certainly not the case for Russia. They see themselves, they would much rather see themselves as a winner of this conflict than as the one accepting something they get because they stopped. The third reason why conflicts could achieve ripeness is the so-called painful pressure from outside. That means that outside actors with influence would have to press hard on sides of the conflict to actually stop hostilities, to engage in a ceasefire. It is notable that both sides, that it's important to remember at this point in time, have actually such powerful allies that could put a lot of pressure. In the case of Ukraine, it's obviously the West, without whose support the war would be very difficult to carry on. In the case of Russia, it is increasingly China and India. Without exports and imports and from China to China, from India and to India, Russia would not be in a position to carry on the war much longer. Nevertheless, we do not see this pressure from either of these sides on the belligerent parties. So I hope I'm somehow on time, but yes. You didn't ask me for a moral judgment. You asked me for a hard description what I think are the obstacles. And in my humble opinion, those are that.
Okay, so we'll in the next round we'll come to the we'll come to the obstacles that we might be able to mitigate. But thank you so much for clearly outlining the situation on both counts. I turn now to Sergio Duarte, please. You'll have to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, and thanks also to Pugwash Canada and to Plowshares for this opportunity. Of course, I agree with what was said before, that the armed aggression against territorial integrity of any state is, of course, prohibited by the Charter of the UN. All members of the organization committed to solve their differences by peaceful means, to refrain from the threat or use of force against the independence or territorial integrity of any state. So special military operation is, in the light of international law, is obviously illegal. It is often asked in these debates that the questions asked are difficult. There are no difficult questions, there are only difficult answers. And one very difficult answer is the one that is being asked here of us. The armed conflict brings geopolitical, cultural, and ideological factors that go much beyond the present realities. The leaders from both sides of the conflict, but particularly from Russia, have rekindled the fear of use of nuclear weapons, and with it the prospect of escalation and all-out nuclear war. The countries involved, including those not participating directly in the operations, possess also huge arsenals of such weapons. So there is a clear and present danger that sooner or later such weapons may be used. But reliance on nuclear weapons may prevent understanding, but it's also a reason for earnest and urgent search for an end to hostilities. In the second half of the 20th century and the age of the current century, nuclear weapon states have justified the existence and the improvement of their arsenals by insisting that their weapons were responsible for keeping peace. The corollary was, of course, that anyone else's capability would endanger peace and stability. But in fact, after 75 years since nuclear weapons began to proliferate, a major war has not broken in Europe except now, the first time under this so-called peace by nuclear weapons that a major war has really broken. So you may say that nuclear deterrence is a factor of peace, except when it fails. And no one can say with certainty what would have happened if Ukraine had kept the weapons that once were in that territory. Whatever the final outcome, the prolongation of this war is against the consciousness of humanity and highlights the specter of nuclear Armageddon more vividly than ever before. We have been asked to look objectively at the situation, try to formulate two difficult answers. About obstacles, I would first note that the conflict seems to have entered a stalemate of sorts. There is no indication that the situation can evolve to a ceasefire anytime soon, and much less to a start of negotiations that could take us to a solution. Hostilities continue unabated. It's not possible to predict now that one of the sides will prevail decisively. Each one seems to be counting on achieving strong positions on the ground before agreeing to sit down and talk. And according to most analysts, the suffering and destruction caused by the war will go on for a long time. The Security Council of the United Nations is primary organ responsible for the maintenance of peace and security, but it is unable to act. Mechanisms that were provided in the Charter to deal with such a situation cannot be put into motion because of the provisions on the decision-making process of the Council. The General Assembly adopted a resolution, but with some negative votes and made abstentions. And in any case, the decisions of the Assembly are only recommendations and they are not mandatory. Over the decades, United Nations mechanisms have worked quite well to keep or restore peace in different regions of the world. In all these cases, international agreed action has been aimed at countries that do not have privilege of the veto. So my inevitable conclusion is that there is something intrinsically wrong with the system. Unless it's able to work, it must be improved or replaced. And this is the first obstacle. Another major obstacle is the evident unwillingness of the major players in the conflict to consider the possibility of a solution short of what each one would define as victory. The positions so far stated by the belligerents seem inflexible and exclude each other. For each to accept the adversary's position would mean retreating from very strongly held convictions that involve national pride, sovereignty over large regions, as well as the welfare and interests of populations with different and sometimes conflicting perceptions about their allegiance and their status. So there is no easy way to address this question. Many aspects of the conflict clearly go beyond the limits of a bilateral dispute. Ukraine relies on the support of NATO for its war effort, And any solution would have to be acceptable, not only to Russia and Ukraine, but also to other countries. And this brings me to the second difficult answer. To overcome these negative factors, an immediate ceasefire is a necessary condition, and negotiations could follow from there. But the problem here for us is that it doesn't, and as the first speaker said, quite rightly, conditions have not been quite ripe for achieving a ceasefire. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll now turn to Sergei Matsanov, please.
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. Second point, I'm of course speaking in a very personal capacity, although it may contradict my previous statement. I have to note that PAGOSH conferences, international PAGOSH, in several of its statements following February 2022, has called for the ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, in order to have better conditions for negotiations on the final settlement. I have put some notes about the major obstacles. However, I think I have to say something before that, but I would like to be extremely short, because discussions about, let's say, violation of the UN Charter or specific provisions of UN Charter, inability of the Security Council to take decisions, proper decisions, because of the right of veto, all these things are not specific to this situation. Why do you think there was no resolution of the UN Security Council during the War of Vietnam? What did Security Council decide about the second, not the first, Iraq War? We didn't decide anything, and the war started, and so on and so forth. But I repeat again, if we start talking about such things, I don't think we would be successful in addressing the problems. This is not to say that we should not keep certain things in mind. Yes, the international system requires improvement. Yes, the attitude of various countries to the limits of the use of force or non-use of force, the boundary between the two, need to be kept in mind, because these attitudes are also evolving, and they have been evolving for the last, 30 years or so, in a very wrong direction. Okay, I need to go to the obstacles. I think that what we have, and my previous words may be confirmed this or confirmed by this, we have an absence or total absence of mutual understanding of reasons why this war happened. The reasons were many. Again, I'm not going to discuss them. Second, the conflict, the war is perceived in most places as a zero-sum game. And zero-sum game has become a guiding principle of various attitudes. Third, total lack of any real serious diplomatic process. And Fourth, and here I may repeat something that has been said, but in different words, maybe, that ceasefire is often described, and I would say described absolutely on purpose, as the end of the road without any further efforts to bring a real peace or to solve the problems. I think we have not, we cannot actually decide now on many things, but what we should do is to see, with the help of which processes or which structures, if you wish, the current stalemate, and I agree there is a stalemate, I agree there is no ripeness, so to say, within the conflict. What can be done to start, let's say, if not destroying the obstacles, but at least shaking them somehow, creating an alternative discourse about the war. And I think an alternative discourse is needed. We have two discourses which are based on the zero-sum game, fine, but that is not the way to the solution. One thing though, I'm almost finished. One thing though, we should not ignore the fact, and again, I am not trying to put finger against somebody or something, but this is obviously a situation that also should be factored in, not necessarily condemned or, you know, using bad words about it. It's a reality that there are more actors and very active actors than just Russia and Ukraine here. But if you, not you, of course, if somebody wants to start seriously moving forward towards the end of the conflict, again, this is something which is not, should not necessarily be proclaimed, but taken into consideration.
Right.
That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. We're all going to have a chance to elaborate further on this in the second round. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Maria Levchenko, please.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I think I will speak on behalf of all Ukrainians, but also on my behalf as a peace builder and a person who has been working in Ukraine since 2014, since the first Russian aggression happened. And I think no country in the world yearns for peace more right now than Ukraine. But we also know that real peace must be just and lasting. And long-lasting peace is possible only after Russian Federation compensates for the damages caused to Ukraine, and Ukraine, the West, and Russian Federation create effective mechanisms that will guarantee security, and it will eliminate all the risk of repeated aggression by the Russian Federation. But I also absolutely agree with Wolfgang that the conflict is not ripe enough right now to be able to proceed with ceasefire. And I think the most obvious problem with recent proposals to freeze the conflict is the fact that a ceasefire would leave 1/5 of Ukraine under Russian control and condemn millions of Ukrainians to a bleak and uncertain future under indefinite Russian occupation. And United investigators have already confirmed that Russia is guilty in committing war crimes in Ukraine. And many observers believe that the ultimate objective of the invasion is the genocide of the Ukrainian nation. Negotiations with Moscow are possible only after the Russian occupying forces leave Ukrainian territory, stop the bombing, stop the killings. Therefore, I see a number of obstacles for the ceasefire. First of all, from Ukrainian perspective, and I'm going to repeat myself, but the primary obstacle to ending the conflict is the Russian aggression. In 2014, Ukraine already emphasized that Russian annexation of Crimea and its support for separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine were violations of our territorial integrity and sovereignty. Russia continued military presence and support for the rebels in DPR and LPR, Donetsk People Republic and Lugansk People Republic, have made it difficult to negotiate a ceasefire or a peaceful agreement even back then, 8 years ago. So recent full-scale invasion just confirmed that. And another crucial obstacle to negotiation is Russia's rigidity and its warm aims, which combine territorial, ideological, and strategic demands. The annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions last September, only partially controlled by Russian forces, established a pretext for additional territorial demands. Therefore, the withdrawal of Russian troops from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine is a basic condition for our country negotiations with the aggressor state. The second one is humanitarian concerns. The conflict had a significant humanitarian impact on the people of Ukraine, all across Ukraine, resulting in a number of refugees and internally displaced persons, in particular people living at the front lines in the east. There have been a number of casualties. Many people have been displaced from their homes, children have been stolen, and people have undergone through the filtration camps. This humanitarian crisis can make it difficult to reach any ceasefire, because our side is reluctant to make concessions that could be seen as compromising our interest or our security. And the last point, which I believe is very important as well, is the deep-seated historical grievances. The history of relationship between Russia and Ukraine is very complex, and there are deep-seated historical grievances of both sides. And they make it really hard to build trust and find a lasting solution to the conflict. Moscow was never satisfied with Ukrainian steps, and it always demanded Kyiv to undertake more and more. For example, in 2010, President Viktor Yanukovych implemented everything that Russia had demanded in President Dmitry Medvedev's open letter to Yushchenko. Nevertheless, Russia continued to demand more and more and more, which resulted in Yanukovych annulling the signing of Ukraine and European Union Association Agreement. And that really charged Ukraine with the highest gas price in Europe. Therefore, many Ukrainians view the conflict as a struggle for national identity and independence, and many Ukrainians are unwilling to make concessions to Russia. Ideologically, Russia remains committed to framing the war as the fight against Ukrainian neo-Nazis, which has to end with regime change in Kyiv. Putin presents the war as an existential fight to preserve the unity of the Russian state and prevent its subordination by the West. Therefore, I believe it makes it very difficult to negotiate a peace agreement that is very acceptable to both sides. I'm going to sum up, and I believe that negotiation ceasefire to end the conflict in Ukraine is complicated by a range of factors, including conflict not being ripe enough, but also Russian aggression, humanitarian concerns, historical grievances, economic and geopolitical considerations, trust-building measures, and any successful negotiation to ceasefire must take into account all these factors and require a willingness from both sides. Thank you. That's it from my side.
Great. Thank you, and thank you to all of you. It's been a sobering 20 minutes or so as you've outlined the very major and severe obstacles to an early end to the fighting in this war. The second question, goes the next step and says, well, is there something we can do about this to ease this situation? The way that we've characterized it is, are there particular obstacles that could be mitigated in some way and begin to move towards the possibility? I think what we'll do is go in the same order, and I'll call upon Wolfgang to get us started on that.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. I have said in the past, and I will say it here again, just the fact that the conflict is not ripe for solution does not mean that the sides cannot start negotiations for humanitarian purposes to mitigate as much as possible humanitarian suffering, human suffering. There are actual negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. between Russian and Ukrainian military representatives sitting in one room going on in Istanbul, Turkey, over grain exports, limited to grain exports. I see no reason, no military, no political reason why such negotiations cannot be extended to other areas. First of all, I would talk about security zones around nuclear power plants. Secondly, I would talk about security zones around hospitals, around education institutions. This can then lead to small temporary ceasefires. A ceasefire for Easter, 3 days. A ceasefire for sowing the fields. Farmers in Ukraine are sick and tired of having to go to the fields to sow their fields and being afraid of shelling and of being attacked. And so do farmers on the other side of the front line that is currently under Russian occupation, for your information. Now, these steps could be small steps that will not bring peace, but that will bring three things. These small steps would, first of all, establish a culture of dialogue and re-establish tiny bits of trust. The trust in the Russian Federation on behalf of Ukraine is currently at zero. By seeing, okay, that temporary ceasefire was kept. That hospital was indeed not shelled. The harvest was respected. Such small steps could be gone to re-establish a little bit of trust, paving the way for a real ceasefire. Secondly, this would gravely reduce the risk of nuclear escalation, as is there. It's being very often talked about as if we don't want to talk about it, but it is very much there. Because when the sides actually sit around the table, whatever they're talking about, it is an opportunity to establish, certain baselines, to establish certain also unofficial red lines. So that would be the second big advantage of such an approach. And I repeat, this would not have any disadvantages for any of the sides. They would not forego the possibility to continue fighting. They would not forego the possibility to continue making the demands the sides are making. That's number one. And the second one is, of course, a hard one. The second one is a really hard one. And this is one where Russia and Ukraine themselves are, I think, only bystanders and not central players, both of them. And this is to have an honest and taboo-free debate about a future European security architecture, about a future functioning European security architecture, in which the European Union, ideally including Ukraine, can feel safe, but also where Ukraine can feel safe until it actually joins the European Union, which will be a while, let's be realistic, but a security architecture in which also Russia can feel safe and does not feel threatened. This seems a little bit utopic at the moment, but this should be the goal of such a discussion. Such a discussion would show serious divisions in Europe, serious divisions between European states and the United States. All of this is now being kind of plastered over by the only thing we can actually agree upon, and that's solidarity with Ukraine as long as it takes, rightly so, but that covers so much, and actually bringing up these painful topics would be another step towards an actual peace. So humanitarian negotiations, both sides need to be pushed to them by their respective allies. They need to be pushed. Ukraine needs to be pushed by the West. Russia needs to be pushed by China and India, if that's at all possible, without foregoing any other opportunities without foregoing the possibility to defend. So diplomacy during combat operations and a debate about the European security architecture.
Great, thank you so much. It's been, as all of them have been very, very helpful, and I'm going to go now to Sergio.
I'm mute. Okay, now I'm mute. Yes, thank you. Now I just want to make one clarification for Sergey. I did not put this question of the Security Council in this particular situation. What I tried to say is that Security Council has been unable to act in any case in which any of the 5 permanent members was involved. It worked quite well in other situations when they were not involved, but whenever it comes to the 5 permanent members, then we have a problem with the Security Council. And of course, it is something that has to be addressed because the world cannot function well if 5 nations can do what they want to do and they are never sanctioned, they are never held responsible for that. Now, the obstacles I mentioned, of course, that have been mentioned above, cannot be mitigated easily or quickly. This is, as they say in French, cela va sans dire. But they can be alleviated. Some suggestions, we heard some interesting suggestions right now. If we have enough common sense to realize that we are all in peril, and if the peril is understood that it exists, then there is hope that we may collectively avert it. Bertrand Russell and Einstein wrote this in the Manifesto 1955. And much what has been said or suggested can be dismissed as wishful thinking. But of course, we must be creative if we want to achieve any solution. I think that as the economic, social costs increase, and political costs too, increase for both sides in the war, and also pressure for negotiated solution grows, it is reasonable to suppose that both belligerents would favor evolving to a ceasefire, if they can be convinced of that, and if the costs rise for them. The catch here is that each one seems to be thinking that the time is not right for any initiative on their side, on their part, with minimal chances of success. Accounts from observers of the operations on the ground believe that each is currently mounting new offensives that they hope would give me an edge in a future negotiated settlement. That may prove illusory, but if each becomes confident that the gains from a negotiation would outweigh the losses, then a group of influential countries, particularly from outside the conflict, might be able to broker a diplomatic settlement and set the stage for a more durable peace. If we assume a ceasefire is achievable, the parties to the conflict should aim at facilitating, the outside parties, not the two belligerents, should aim at facilitating direct talks between Russia and Ukraine on the terms of a permanent peace agreement. Such an agreement can conceivably leave aside for the beginning of the process the thorny question of territorial boundaries. It is important to stress that international law does not condone the acquisition of land by force, but we can wait a little bit and try to settle that in a second moment. Entrenched and sanguine positions on this matter may suggest the institution of a temporary buffers or demilitarized zones, or small, as just was suggested, small zones in which there will be more humanitarian activity. One standing example, of course, is what is now the dividing line between North and South Korea. So of course, it has its own particulars. You cannot equate both situations, but this has been tried and done before. Setting buffer zones between belligerents. Unfortunately, reason and common sense do not always govern the actions and decisions of individuals, including leaders and political rulers. So more often, with leaders and political rules and with individuals. It is vitally important that the world becomes aware of the existential risks of the current situation and redouble the efforts together to reverse the downward path. International community must also demand compliance with the commitments and principles contained in the instruments of international law. Public opinion has a fundamental role to play in this regard. Humankind cannot forever be hostage to the unpredictable relations between powers armed with the most destructive and indiscriminate weapons ever invented. We cannot remain for a long time, much longer, at the whims of countries armed with those weapons. We must find a solution, and we must strive for a solution. And I think that if we muster a group of countries that may be willing to work on that regard, I think there might be a possibility to bring up important and workable solutions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. And I'll turn now to Sergey.
Yes, I'm unmuting myself. Thank you again. Now, I think I have a temptation to, let's say, depart from my introductory remarks the first time when I said that I'm not representing anyone apart from myself, and say, let me now tell you what a number of Russians think. And that would not be very pleasant. And I can never say that I can speak on behalf of all Russians, because there are different views in Russia about many things, including this one. Seriously, there is a strong belief and something, let's say, I am kind of accustomed to think geopolitically in my head since long ago. And if I'm not going to, let's say, what I'm going to say is not the repetition of what somebody else said. I came to this conclusion long ago. That we are observing a new model of a so-called great power rivalry. And the model is the model that is being imposed by the West and by the United States in particular. While the model is that while avoiding the all-out nuclear conflict, there is a need to weaken as much as possible both Russia and maybe even more China by creating along their borders a series of hostile countries, pumping weapons there and letting them create problems for Russia and China, maybe together, maybe separately, doesn't matter. Very dangerous trends are now very obvious in the Western Pacific or in Far East Asia, whatever you look at it from. I'm talking about the same region. Over the years, suddenly, not suddenly, but step by step, the NATO borders were moving east. And the more they were moving, the more there was a hysteria about the Russian threat. Of course, it so happened that NATO borders were coming closer and closer to Russia, and Russia is a great military power as well. So the threat was growing for those territories of NATO that were coming closer and closer to Russia. Now, that has to be understood. And finally, With the coup d'etat in Kiev, which violated the Budapest Memorandum because the coup d'etat was assisted by the United States, and with the passive attitude of Germany and France to that, Ukraine, as a result, moved away from a number of basic principles that were in the foundation of its independence. I'm talking specifically about the Declaration of Independence that was taken by Ukraine or adopted. I think it was 1990 or 91, not sure, but not earlier, not later, which proclaimed Ukraine as a neutral and non-nuclear country. I remember that well because that produced a shocking effect in the Russian military system, in the sense that they didn't want to withdraw nuclear weapons from Ukraine. And Ukraine wanted those nuclear weapons to be withdrawn. Then something else started to happen. Well, thank you. I apologize for this. But I think that discussion about these things would not really be productive. We need to keep these things in mind. We need to, let's say, impress on all parties involved, and these are more than just two parties which are involved, so that they make an effort to understand all the variety of concerns, fears, let's say, perceptions. In that sense, negotiations on, well, not negotiations, process towards new European security structure or architecture, of course, would be helpful. But if the ceasefire is difficult to achieve, that would be even more difficult to start before certain other things take place. I think I have to finish.
Thank you.
Yes, and but thank you for bringing all of those things to our attention. Now, Maria.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that it doesn't matter what geopolitical structure or architecture is being played out right now. It doesn't give a right to any country to bomb another country and to kill its people. It doesn't matter what Russia was not agreeing to NATO expansion. Did it give the right for Russia to militarily intervene and wage wars with Ukraine? Not really. Imagine waking up at 5 a.m. in your capital from bombings. I wonder how that would make you feel. In any ways, I wanted to say, a stable ceasefire can occur only if West helps Ukraine to use its current momentum to secure a sufficiently advantageous position from which it will be able to effectively deter any Russian attack, even if the correlation of forces changes and Western support falls. We have to understand that for many Ukrainians, this war is a war for survival. After atrocities in Bucha and Irpin, we see this war as a genocide against our nation. This is not about NATO expansion. This is about destroying and killing as many Ukrainians as possible. Therefore, I believe that mitigating Russian aggression and supporting Ukrainian territorial integrity is a critical step towards ceasefire. This could include diplomatic pressure on Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, increased sanctions and economic pressure, and support for the Ukrainian military. Actors in Europe and elsewhere can reach out to people in Russia other than Putin or anyone else right now in the government to support the talks on the condition on Putin removal and being held accountable. For example, big businesses have been already feeling the pressure from the economic sanctions, and they could be the one that you can reach out to talk and try to put as much pressure as possible. Also, there can be pressure coming from such actors as China to demand adherence to the international law, stopping atrocities, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, stopping threatening behavior around nuclear power plant, and ensuring humanitarian access for people in need and return of those being held in Russia, in particular our children, which are being kept in Russia. While this might not end the war and allow for a ceasefire, this really can reduce the risk of worsening the war, even with nuclear incidents. Therefore, I believe there should be a lot of international pressure, international diplomatic efforts, such as coming from Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, UN, just to stop those atrocities that Russia is committing right now in Ukraine. And I believe that resolving the war in Ukraine and trying to go into the ceasefire will really require a diverse or multi-faced approach that really addresses the underlying political issues within Russia, mitigates the humanitarian crisis, and creates a more stable and secure environment for for my country and for my people. And the key success for Ukraine and the key success for ceasefire is that Ukraine has really fortified our territorial power and strengthen our military capabilities. And also wanted to add one more last thing. We never had a coup d'etat. We always had an officially elected president. And with that, I'm going to finish up my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So that concludes our first two rounds, and we wanted to take a little bit of time now exchanging amongst the panelists, and if you have comments or further comments or questions on or want to elaborate on your own comments, this would be the time to do it. And I see that Wolfgang has raised his hand, and so that's a good chance for you to start this part of the session. Unmute.
Yes, that is just a tiny intervention of not even a minute, but I want to understand if I understood correctly, because I was very heartened by certain things that Marie Levchenko just said, by some things that she just said, and I want to ask her if I understood right that she would actually support an extension of negotiations purely in the humanitarian field from the grain deal to encompass other areas. That's a question.
Yes. Right now, as any Ukrainian, all we want peace, and we want to stop suffering of our people. So if we can right now work on the prisoners exchange or humanitarian access in the form of any kind of negotiations, we would support that, but nothing beyond that.
And I'll come back to you. Were you going to follow up on this issue, Wolfgang, or something new?
No, that's fine. That's
okay.
it.
I'll go to Sergei.
You're muted, Sergei.
Well,
Yeah.
I was trying to locate the button to unmute myself. So excuse me for taking some seconds for that.
Fine.
Two different points. I think it is not productive to exchange slogans here. But there are more Ukrainian refugees in Russia than elsewhere. It's a fact. The children were not stolen. The children were provided accommodation in the best, really the best, sanatoria and places in Crimea, which used to be world famous actually, but and so on and so forth. On the question of starting exchange, some diplomatic efforts, I think it is very positive that China came forward with a paper some time ago and expressed readiness to involve in the process of looking for the solution. Despite the pressure which was rather rudely applied at China and publicly, that China should do this or should go that she should go to Kiev right now, and so on and so forth. China cannot be pressured into such things, but it can be convinced to do to make certain moves if approached in a proper way. I also see as a positive thing the Chinese decision to send out a team headed by, I forgot the name, but this is the guy who used to be at some point Chinese ambassador in Moscow. Of course, this mission can only be exploratory as far as China is concerned. But that is also possible. It cannot work very quickly, but it is positive. I think it has to be encouraged. Another thing to be explored, I think, is the interests of Lula, who became again the president of Brazil, and who expressed interest in contributing towards identification of ways to put an end to this war. Now, let them work and give them maybe ideas, but not impose ideas on them, what they should or should not do. Give them different ideas. And I think this process perhaps would be expanded, because at the end of the day, it's not, I mean, we, and I mean now by we, not just people who are sitting in front of our screens or around our table. It's difficult to say in advance that, okay, this country can become a moderator or a negotiator or convener of something. It has to go through a certain process, because some countries may not be successful in that sense. I hope China and Brazil could be successful, for example. You may need to bring other players and so on and so forth. So I think this thing should be supported. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm sure, Maria, I notice your hand is now raised. So I'm going to go to Maria first, and then to Sergio, in particular with reference to the references to Brazil as well. But Maria, please.
Yeah, I'm just gonna share a very quick comment. I don't want to turn this into debate or something like that. I just wanted to remind that on March 17, International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian Children's Rights Commission Maria Lvova-Belova for stealing our children. And there is a number of proven facts how children have been taken after so-called filtering, after the death of their parents, and after the separation from their parents. And all the efforts to return the children from Crimea, where they're so-called going through these very nice camps where they can relax and enjoy themselves, have never been very successful from the Ukrainian state. So what I'm trying to say is that if the International Criminal Court has issued the arrest warrants, that speaks a lot. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Yes, but thank you very much. And we're going to go now to Sergio to call on. I assume you're going to respond to the reference to Brazil, but any other points you'd like to make as well, please.
Thank you. Well, I've been out of government now for over 20 years that I do not represent Brazil in anywhere. So what I'm going to say is my view, not the view of the Brazilian government. But of course, what Lula said is public. And what Lula said is that no one is talking about peace. Everyone talks about war, but no one is talking about peace. So he said it's time that we put together a number of countries that are willing to talk about peace and see what can be done. He has made no other specific suggestion what should be done or what should not be done. And above all, he has not put blame on each of the parties involved. And when I say the parties involved, it's not only Russia and Ukraine, but he did not put blame on any of the parties involved. And I think this clarifies what Lula said. And I can only hope, as a former diplomat, as a member of the human race, I think I can only hope that what Lula said is heard, is listened to, and a number of countries that have the possibility of bringing, a good influence in what is happening, that these countries act together and try to bring some solution of influence in some positive way to end the hostilities, to end suffering, and eventually to bring peace, to bring to the world the hope that weapons of mass destruction will never be wielded again, will never be threatened again against anyone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call on you, Wolfgang, for one more comment in this go round, and alert Robin that I'll call on you next then to present some of the questions from the from our participants. Okay, Wolfgang, please.
I'll be again very short. First comment, very quick, to Sergei. Sergei tried to kind of mask his statement regarding the origins of the war with the sentence that that's what many Russians say. So I will hold that in your favor, because that is indeed what many Russians say. It doesn't make large part of it much truer. And it is in great part, I mean, I don't want to go into every detail here, but there are certain aspects that really do not hold the water here, which you did not state as your opinion, but what you said is true. That's what many Russians think. It's true. Now, we have seen now a lot of talking about the war from above. What, Lula should do, and what this country should impress on this country, and it's a great power conflict, and this and that. I think what we should do is look at the war a little bit from below, from the ground, from the side of the people that are actually victims of this war. Because then it becomes not a matter of great power politics, but a matter of human morals, to actually go for an end of the conflict, for an end of the suffering. And I say this even if it involves certain types of compromise. And now will come my critical comment to Maria. Maria, you said you speak for all Ukrainians with your statements that are beautifully formulated, and with large part of which I would agree. But with that part that you speak for all Ukrainians, I sharply disagree. I used to live in Ukraine for 7 years. I know many people. I have welcomed many friends of mine from Ukraine, also from Eastern Ukraine, from Kiev, in Europe, and their opinions on whether a compromise can and should be made, under which conditions a compromise could or should be made, are really very varied. I say, as they would be in any good European country. In no normal country, everybody thinks the same about one big thing. This would be very rare. So this is as an honorable view stated by Maria, but it is not the view of all Ukrainians. And honestly, as it always is in war, and I have been also to Eastern Ukraine. I spent a lot of time in Donetsk during shelling, in Kramatorsk, on both sides of the contact line. The closer people are to the actual bloody horror that may come sooner or later, further than that, the more they are ready to sacrifice for peace. This is not, again, not a moral statement. It's a matter of fact. And one more thing I will say, and I will say this about, again, both Russia and Ukraine, although for completely different reasons. I think to believe opinion polls in the current mood in both Russia and Ukraine is extremely ill-advised. People in Russia are simply afraid because Russia is rapidly marching to being a complete dictatorship. It used to be an authoritarian democracy where there were large amounts of freedom if you behaved well up to, short time ago. But over the past months, it has really turned something into something where you need to be afraid for your freedom when you actually speak up in public. That would be the state that is here in the oppressing role. Ukraine is a different story. I think people also, particularly when they're inside Ukraine, also, if they do not share the opinion that is often presented as the opinion of all Ukrainians, will actually prefer to remain silent or to express their views only in private, or to express them to friends in Europe when they're outside of Europe, and then and then add the coda to when they just said something really profound, but please don't tell anybody in Ukraine that I said that. That would be really not good for me. So, but there the threat doesn't really come from the state. But a society in war will always be a society where, truth and freedom to speak are under threat. And so my call is to look at the people suffering from the conflict, to really listen to the people in depth, not listen to diplomatic slogans, but listen to basic humanity. I know this is not a policy prescription. It does not, it is not pro ceasefire, and it does not put a condition here or condition there, but it could be something like a lodestar, like a shining star showing us the direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call on Robin now to so that we can engage with our the other participants in this session. And Maria, you may have feel like responding to some of the things that are said, and I hope you'll take that opportunity during the course of the further discussion. Robin, do you have some
Yes.
questions, comments for the panel?
Yes, we have a number of questions. To those who are thinking of adding questions, I ask keep them as brief as possible. We've got limited time, and I may have to consolidate some of the questions. I'll start with the first one. This refers on the subject of the belief that there's a stalemate that has not yet been broken. And I just wanted to note that in this answer to this question, we had two different versions of the stalemate. One that is a hurting stalemate, and the other is more or less the status quo stalemate, and these are different. So the question comes from Anna Romaniuk, and she's asking about Russia's motives, asking for thoughts in light of the discussion of macro geopolitics involved in the war. Would you say that the motives of Russia in this war are logical and rational, or are they influenced by some personal and maybe not psychologically stable ambitions of the leader?
Well, that's a fairly pointed question about Russia. Sergei, do you want to comment on that? I see Wolfgang, you have raised your hand, and if you're ready to speak, Sergei, please do. Or if you want to collect your thoughts, I'll go to Wolfgang.
Well, maybe Wolfgang can start. I would continue then.
Okay.
He raised it earlier than he was the first to raise it. Anyway,
but since it is directed at Russia, I mean, you should feel free to start off.
Okay, as we say, I'm in your hands, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, say that again.
as we say, I'm in your hands, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Well, in that case, please carry on, and then I'll go to Wolfgang.
Okay. Well, this is a complex and complicated question at the same time. I personally do not have no doubts that the geopolitical situation was the one that I have described. Maybe I have not described it comprehensively enough, and I would not try to do it now. I think this is important part of the picture that has to be taken into account, as I said, in those various efforts to bring peace in this part of the world, or Europe, if you wish. Whether the fact that, or whether this problem needed to be solved by military means, I think is a separate question. But even if you, let's say, accept, or if we accept that it is a separate question, it doesn't mean that the first one disappears, because in my view, it was an important factor that resulted in in February 22. The second part of the question is whether there is a kind of irresponsible idiot or something sitting at the helm of Russia and taking all the decisions. Well, I think it was not formulated correctly enough for such kind of a discussion. But let me try to answer the substance of it. And the substance would be, to the best of my understanding, no. The answer would be no. To the extent that I could know, and I'm out of government for, let's say, about 30 years, more even than Sergio. Anyway, there were discussions, there were debates among groups. To the extent that I can know, those were debates basically about whether there is still room for diplomacy or not. And not everyone in the top leadership were had opening positions, ruling out that, or based on the assumption that there was no further room for diplomatic efforts. But that is what the debate ended in February 22. Thank you.
Thank you. Call you, Wolfgang, and also invite Maria and Sergio to weigh in on this if you like. We'll good to keep our responses fairly brief, since we want to get more questions in. Wolfgang.
I think if we brief, so I'll be brief again. I think the motivation by Putin and his inner circle, which really was the most inner circle of Putin, to attack militarily Ukraine, was one built on brutal 19th century realist foreign policy. Spheres of influence. The calculation was not to occupy Ukraine. I think the calculation was to quickly change the government in Kiev, make Kiev a loyal satellite or a more loyal satellite again and then pull back, mission accomplished. Yet it turned out, this decision, this attack decision, this breach of international law turned out to be probably the biggest single foreign policy miscalculation, at least since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Everything turned out to be completely different than President Putin actually expected. And to be fair, also than the West expected. Nobody expected Ukraine to withstand so toughly, so heroically. Nobody expected that spirit, and it's not only the spirit alone, you don't win. That ability to fight by the Ukrainian army, and least of all, Mr. Putin. I really think that if the costs would have been known, this invasion may not have happened.
Thank you to both of you. Either Ria or Sergio want to add anything at this point?
I really don't have anything to add. I think it has been an interesting discussion. I would only point out that it is fairly common in situations that put one country against another. It's fairly common for both sides to raise doubts about the sanity, psychological sanity of the opponent. We've seen this in many instances, and I refuse very much to believe in these things, because much of that, of course, is pure propaganda. I think that if someone raises to the top leadership in one's country, there must be some good reason for that. Now, having said that, I think that what is really lacking is not psychological balance. What really is lacking, and I think it's not only on one side, is common sense. In the sense that, as I tried to say before, I think it is untenable for the whole world that international relations continue to be hostage to the kind of weapon that can wipe all of us together. And not only, it would be very good if they could wipe out only the belligerents. That would be very good. We would be rid of them. But unfortunately, all of us are on the same ship. And I think it's a real lack of common sense on all sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything, Maria, at this point, or do you want to go to the next question, please?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I think it also was a common misunderstanding coming from the Russian Federation that Ukrainians will greet Russian soldiers with flowers, which did not happen. And of course, would not happen because we are protecting our land and our children. So I would also say that even if Russia believes that it can decide security decisions and make decisions for the neighboring countries, it doesn't mean that it has right to do so. And many Russian neighbors actually feel threatened by the policy that Russia is trying to implement. We can take Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, or Nagorno-Karabakh, and even Baltic countries are feeling very much threatened by the policies that Russia is trying to implement. So I'd say it was a very big misunderstanding in the way how we function, how we think, and what we feel about our national identity. And also it was fueled very much by propaganda and coming from those separatist regions that the other parts of Ukraine would also support what has been happening there. That's short from my side.
Great. Thank you very much. Robin, let's go to another question or comment.
Peggy Mason notes that if China and the USA are both engaged as joint mediators, that gives reassurances to both sides to enter ceasefire negotiations without an answer for every big issue in advance. The question: what is the panel's view on what can be done? That is, civil society, experts, governments like Canada, to convince the U.S. that the best way forward is for the leading patrons of the warring parties, China and the USA, to declare their intention to jointly mediate a negotiated end to the conflict, beginning with a ceasefire negotiation. What is the panel's view on that?
Okay. Anybody want to start with that? Sergey. Unmute.
Apologies. Peggy, I appreciate your question, but I don't have a good answer for it, because to the extent I can see and analyze, one of the reasons for the current stalemate and the difficulty of going towards ceasefire and so on and so forth is, in fact, the US strategy. So for the US and its strategy, it's very unnatural, or it would be very unnatural to call for a ceasefire. Now, I would like to be proved to be wrong, but this is what I tend to think. Well, another element, of course, is that while it is true that the US is the patron of one of the warring party, it's not true as far as China is concerned. However, I don't think we should operate that, because China has big concerns about the war in Ukraine, or situation with Ukraine. China sees, now I'm not from China, of course, but it is my own analysis, but China would not like to see the loss of its European market, or European market for its products. There are very troublesome signs that in Europe, following, of course, the United States lead, there is an attempt to ban certain Chinese products, like Huawei, like other electronics, and complicate, in any case, Chinese export into Europe. So weakening of Europe, even economically, severing the communication lines between China and Europe is not in the interests of China. And this, in my view, is one of the reasons why China decided to step in and start doing something. For the US, well, I don't know. I don't see it in a very short. I don't see it happening in a very short term. Thank you.
Wolfgang.
Yeah, again, at the peril of maybe reducing complexity a bit too much, but I see close to zero prospect for this, for the simple reasons that mediators need to be accepted by both sides. And I do not see any reason why Russia would accept the United States, that clearly and openly associates itself with one of the sides of the conflict, should accept the US as a mediator. I also see nearly as little reason for Ukraine to accept China as a mediator, China that not quite as openly, but nearly quite as clearly supports the Russian war effort, in Ukraine. So I think at least one of the parties is not trusted at all by any one of the two belligerents. So I think that is out of the window. I even believe that the world is now in a state where no individual nation of any major standing could actually act as a mediator. So I think if one looks for a mediator, one would have to recur to personalities that would be given the legitimacy of a large organization, such as the UN or the OSCE. Because personalities, single men and women, still exist who enjoy both the trust of Russia and of Ukraine, because they have a track record of being honest, of being impartial. I do not want to name names here, but I could at least think of 5 who would have such a personal capacity. So I think this is, and this needs, of course, being given legitimacy by an international organization. But I think the dream that Lula or China or US or the European Union, least of all, could act as a mediator is just a dream.
Thank you. I'm going, Sergey. Okay, Sergey has a hot response, and then I'll come to you, Sergio. Sergey.
Yes, I ask for the floor to endorse what Wolfgang has just said. One has to look not, I would say, not that one does not need to look at states, but one needs to look at both states and individuals of the kind Wolfgang has described. Full stop at the moment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Sergio, please.
Yeah, well, I also tend to agree with what Wolfgang has said. If we go to the Latin root of the word mediator, mediator is someone who stands in the middle. Neither the US nor China, and especially the US, is very far from the middle in this question.
Mhm.
And none of them, I think, would be acceptable to the two belligerents, to the two main parties, as innocent, good faith mediator. Now, this idea of having individuals instead of countries to try to do something about it, I think it's quite interesting. But of course, you cannot dissociate a person than what he or she represents. If you choose personalities, inevitably they have behind them the weight of the way in which their respective nations are perceived in the world. But that was an interesting suggestion, perhaps, because normally this role should go to the UN. But as I tried to say at the beginning of my remarks, the UN, unfortunately, is too much in the hands of 5 countries, and these 5 countries don't seem very able to find a solution for anything, especially when they are the main interested parties.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Robin, can you allow me one quick follow-up question? In negotiations, and I mean, there are mediators. There are also guarantors for the belligerents. Giving belligerents when in negotiations a kind of sense of there will be some capacity to implement this because we have guarantors who have agreed to this and are with it. Is that a role that the U.S. and China could play? Sergio, please.
No, let's speak of guarantors. Guarantors come after you have a solution, then you can have a guarantor of the solution, but not before.
Yeah. Okay.
And then again, perhaps, I mean, it depends on the kind of solution that you arrive at. Then you have to choose to see which countries qualify or be accepted to be guarantor. But guarantor is something that happens afterwards. The second step. It's another moment in the process.
Okay, thank you, Wolfgang. Unmute.
Two very quick comments. The first one, I started by committing that sin, but I would just like to remind that this is actually a sin without really prefacing it. To talk here about two belligerents could imply a certain moral equivalence that is simply not there. We are here talking about an attacker and an attacked, yeah? So that I really want to preface that yet again. And the second thing is that when we talk about guarantors, Russia doesn't need a guarantor, it has nuclear weapons. Russia's nuclear weapons are its guarantor for any peace treaty. It's Ukraine who needs guarantors. And I think in that role, that is a role that the United States could very well play, absolutely. Russia does not need China to guarantee its territorial sovereignty or anything. They have their nuclear weapons to do that.
Yeah, good point. Robin, I'll go back, and I mean our time is winding down, but Sylvia, I'm going to propose that we extend the Q&A period because I'm in the process of sort of backing out from making a.
I just want to advise everyone. Maria had sent me a note earlier that she had previous commitment, so she needs to depart now. And I would like to thank her very much for her time and her support and finding ways to mitigate certain obstacle to help us and help at the end of the suffering. So I just want to say thank you to Maria right now. Thank you. Right. And then we can proceed, Ernie, for sure. Thank you.
Right. Maria, do you have time to make any concluding comment? Or?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just make a last brief comment. Thank you so much. And thank you for the interest from international community coming towards this war, which is devastating. And it's devastating for Russia as well. As we have seen, it has a huge impact on Russia economy. Also, many Russian citizens are dying every day. But I truly believe that we will find a path to peace only when Russia withdraws all the forces, and it will be the first step. So that's it from my side, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, and great pleasure to have you with us and provide us the insane insights and the perspective that you have. Appreciate it a whole lot. All the best.
Thank you. All the best.
As I was saying, Sylvia and Robin, I'm going to propose that we extend the Q&A a bit of time, and really I'll forego my summarizing comments because it's a very complex and detailed discussion. It might not mean that much, but hearing further from the audience, I think would be a productive use of our time.
Well, I'll just keep the last 2 minutes for you. I'll let you know 2 minutes at the end. So we respect 2 hours. Thank you.
Sure. Robin.
Okay. In this, I'm going to try to combine a few questions now because some of them are linked. A question from Doug. Actually, there's 2. I'm going to combine them. The panel's view of an international commission appointed by the UN arbitrating the Russia-Ukraine dispute. Could this be the start of effective diplomacy? And he also asks whether we are underestimating here the role of the UN and General Assembly and possibly the Uniting for Peace resolution, which circumvents the Security Council deadlock to a certain extent. So that would be the combined question.
Okay, thank you for that. Sergey, I see that your hand is up. Is that for this question? Please.
Well, actually, it was not. It was for the previous one. But anyway, on this question.
Sure.
First of all, actually, my previous response fits into this as well. I support what Sergio said, that you first need to have an agreement, arrangement, whatever, and then start talking about who would guarantee that. here as well, the UN Commission. It seems to me that we first need to ensure a certain structure, or to invent a certain structure with countries that would be able to to perform this mediating role, and then decide how you call it, UN Commission or something different from that. I'm not very much in favor of a UN Commission, but well, it is a further question, a question further down the road. As to the United for Peace, I frankly have only one example, can remember only one example when that worked, and that worked only when Russia, or Soviet Union, sorry, for the reasons that are still subject to debate, decided not to, no, it was, sorry, I apologize, it was in the Security Council that the Soviet Union didn't participate. No, I don't think it will work in this situation. Thank you.
Wolfgang and Sergio, did you want to respond to the UN appointed commission idea? Sergio, I see your hand is up, please.
I tend to agree with Sergei. I think the UN would not be very well qualified to be appointed, or a commission by the UN would be qualified, for the simple reason that at least one of the parties has its own reasons to believe that the UN would be biased one way or another. Now, I really wanted to comment on the question of arbitration that was raised. Arbitration, again, is something that the two parties in a conflict or a dispute, they have to decide who will be the arbitrator. And first of all, you have to decide what you'll be arbitrating about. And in this question of Ukraine and Russia, I think it will be quite hard to formulate a question to the arbiter. What are you going to arbitrate about? Who is right or who is wrong? Who has a claim to certain parts of land or not? Which parts of the population should be citizen of one side or the other? So I think for anyone who would have this very thorny task of being the arbiter, it will be a very difficult question. But a more difficult question would be how to formulate the question to the arbiter. And I don't see arbitration in this. I say this: Brazil has neighbored boundaries with 10 neighbors, 10 countries. None of them was result of war. None of them was result of armed conflict. All of them were either negotiated between the two parties or by an arbiter that was chosen by both parties. And this is a must. I don't see this question of any of these two countries, Russia or Ukraine, agreeing to an arbiter.
Right. Thank you, Wolfgang.
I think the sides have gone way too far, have sacrificed way too much, have lost way too much to accept any type of arbitration award. That is not exactly according to their maximal demands and ideas. That's it.
Thank you. We're going to go to Robin for one last question, and I just wanted to insert the idea of tables for some track 2 diplomacy, which include Russians, Ukrainians, supporters on both of them, which the possibility for exploring issues and so forth, a step removed from the formal, whether anybody would like to comment on that. But first, Robin's question.
There's several questions here, and so I'm going to pick one. My expression of concern to all those whose questions haven't been asked. It's actually a comment, but I'm asking for a response from the panelists to this by David Parnas. He's noted that there's been no mention of the biggest barriers to peace in this discussion, which he sees as nobody wants peace. For example, the US shows no sign of wanting peace. Biden's words about Northern Ireland and Sudan are very different from what he says about Ukraine, although they are true of Ukraine. Zelensky's supporters say that his agreeing to peace would be political suicide. The first 8 years of the war are always ignored by the West. People believe the war started in 2022. There's been fighting in Ukraine since 2013. It has never stopped. Those who speak for peace are labeled traitors. People say that time for peace has not yet come. Actually, the time is long past. Comments on this, please.
Who would like to start that?
I can start if you want.
Okay. Yes, please do. Please do.
I mean, there is not one question. There's a number of questions. Yes, the war started. The hostilities started in 2013, but they reached first of all, this was a completely different conflict. That was a conflict that had elements of a war from Russia against Ukraine, but also had elements of a conflict, of an inner Ukrainian conflict. It's a complex thing that will go way beyond the time I have now, but it was not a pure attack war. This has now reached a completely new dimension. It has gone into a purely, the war has reached a new stage, a completely different form as a war of aggression of one nation against the other. So while for the same reasons that were mentioned many times, I do not believe in a functional peace now. I believe that what could be done could be what was done during the past 8 years in Minsk, namely try to sit together, try to minimize human suffering as much as possible, and have at least the effects of a war that the sides obviously do not want to stop be mitigated and minimized by the power of negotiation.
Thank you very much. Both Sergio and then Sergey.
Thank you. I'll simply say that there is always a time for peace. I think we should not resign ourselves to say that the time for peace has passed and will never come back. Peace is always in front of us, and it depends basically on will. If we want to find peace, we will find peace. It is very important that in any conflict, both parties agree or decide that it's time for them to look for peace. And unfortunately, in this current conflict, none of the two parties seems to believe in that. And none of them, those who back them also don't seem to believe that it is time for peace. But we have to believe, we have to say, well, it is time for peace. Let's try. Let's do whatever we can. Let's try. If you are working in this field, if you are a diplomat or a former diplomat like Sergey and I, you can always think that there must be an opportunity for peace. Thank you.
Thank you. We have only a short while left. Sergey, please.
Yes. Thank you. There was, of course, the big difference between what was continuing from 2014 and what started in February 2022. Again, we don't have time to go into that in detail. But what happened then with the Minsk Accords agreements, we often kind of ignore that. Minsk agreements were, in fact, and among other things, a clear recognition by the Russian Federation that Donetsk, Lugansk areas, regions, whatever, oblast, were Ukrainian. And the goal was, through a certain sequence of measures, to come to the situation when Ukraine would be able to reestablish its sovereignty there without, let's say, detriment to the population, to people who were living there. And they were not implemented. Why? Now certain things became clear. Ukraine didn't want them to be implemented. At the same time, Russia was sanctioned for Minsk agreements not being implemented, and so on. Now, today it may not be of such a great relevance, but yes, there was a big, in any case, big difference between the periods 2013 or 14 till 2022 and what is going on now, of course. And it's really difficult to make kind of linkages here.
Thank you very much. I have a feeling that we could extend this conversation quite a bit on that final point, as well as many others that were raised. But our time is up, and I must say that I've listened in on quite a number of conversations and panels on Ukraine, but we're extraordinarily fortunate to have the kind of insights and panelists who've agreed to be with us today. Deep understanding of the issues, important support for the pursuit of peace, even though the capability or the likelihood of that does not seem imminent. But I think you've helped us a whole lot to think more about this and how to approach our own colleagues and our own governments about their responses to the conflict as we move forward. Huge thanks to all of our speakers, Sergei Batsanov, Maria Levchenko, and Wolfgang Sporar, and Sergio Duarte. You're very generous with your time and your insights for us, and we appreciate that deeply. I promised that we would have have a paper come out of this, and we'll certainly be in touch and in consultation with you in that process. Thank you also to the audience. I know that there are a lot of you there who put in comments and questions which we weren't able to get to. We thank you for all of that, and we hope that you've benefited from this discussion in the same way that we have. Sylvie, is there any final comment that you want to?
No, thank you very much to everyone. Yes, there will be a paper. Yes, there will be letters that will be sent to various groups, and we hope that you will continue to be encouraged to talk about peace and start more of a movement for peace to be an acceptable concept in what's going on right now. Understanding all the context, I remain a positive. And at my age, I've decided that I have a duty of hope. So it was wonderful to listen to you today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, thank you to everybody. And
thank you.